While there are several reviews of the GHK AUG on the internet, in-depth documentation is harder to find. This video will explore its operation, variants, problems, upgrade potential, and real steel parts compatibility, covering all the details inside and out. First, let's run through basic operation. The AUG fires from a closed bolt. To load the rifle, insert a gassed and loaded magazine into the magazine well and ensure it seats fully. The magazine release will pop out when the magazine is fully seated. Rack the charging handle to load the first BB and cock the hammer. Austrian military doctrine teaches an underhanded grip on the charging handle to avoid hitting your knuckles on the scope. The fire selector located above the trigger has safe, semi, and progressive positions. On the progressive setting, a half pull will fire semi-auto, while a full pull will fire full auto. When the magazine is empty, the bolt will lock open. Push the magazine release with your thumb and simultaneously pull the magazine out. After inserting a new magazine, rack the charging handle to unlock the bolt and resume firing. To fire from a rest or wall, pull the foregrip down to unlock it, then rotate forward until it is parallel with the barrel. To remove the barrel, first pull the charging handle to the rear, then push it upwards to lock it in place. On the left side of the receiver, push in the small thumb button to unlock the barrel, twist it 30 degrees clockwise, and extract it from the rifle. Removing the barrel exposes the hop-up adjustment. Twist the wheel clockwise to decrease hop, or counterclockwise to increase hop. Reinstall the barrel by inserting it in the front of the receiver at an angle, and once fully seated, twist until it clicks into place. If firing left-handed, the ejection port cover can be pulled out and inserted on the right side of the gun. Since this is airsoft, there is no ejecting brass to worry about, but the bolt is capable of pinching skin or facial hair if not covered. To field strip the rifle, remove the barrel as described before. Release the bolt and make sure there is no magazine in the rifle. Push the locking latch in the middle of the stock all the way to the right and it will release the receiver. Pull the receiver forward and the bolt will also come free. On the stock, push in the middle of the butt pad to unlock the sling swivel pin and pull it out. The butt pad can now be taken off and the fire control group extracted. Note that it will not come out if the hammer is forward. It will be necessary to insert the bolt and cock the hammer before the fire control group can come out of the gun. And here's the AUG field stripped. Now let's have a look at the factory variants. GHK's AUG with integral sight is primarily based on the A2 model introduced in 1997, but the 3-position selector with a separate semi-only setting was not introduced until the A3 variant. The rails available for the gun also mimic those of the A3. However, GHK does not offer a version with a manual bolt release, so building a correct A3 replica is not yet possible. The gun comes from GHK in 3 barrel lengths: the original 20-inch rifle barrel, the more modern 16-inch carbine barrel, and the 14-inch commando barrel. All 3 are available as barrel kits with their own inner barrels and hop-up units, so they can be swapped out without any disassembly. One additional factory barrel length which GHK did not replicate is the 24-inch H-bar variant with bipod. If you want this, you will either need to build it yourself using a modern production Ratworks bipod as I have, or find a long out-of-production hexagon kit and adapt it to a GBBR. On top of the receiver, there are a number of options for optics. The integral scope is the classic look. While the real one is a 1.5 times zoom, the GHK is about 2 times. The so-called donut of death reticle is accurately replicated, and the glass is clear and generally high quality. Note that there are iron sights on top of the scope housing, but they are not painted by default. If you want a backup RMR type red dot instead of irons, there are 3D printed mounts on Shapeways, or Simoon sells an aluminum rail mount which includes one. If you don't want the rails, they can be safely removed with a Dremel and the mount used on its own. This provides a red dot using the scope as a riser for short-range shooting, while still having the scope for longer range. Alternatively, there are several styles of top rail available. GHK sells A3 variants, while the now defunct FG Airsoft made one in the style of the export model A2. Speaking of rails, GHK also sells the A3 CQC rail. However, note that this replaces the foregrip and bolts into place, so the barrel cannot be removed while it is installed. This makes the hop-up impossible to adjust without disassembly unless a hole is drilled in the receiver to provide access. Now let's move on to problems and upgrades for the gun and start with the barrel. The weak point on the stock barrel is the gas block. Because this is made of aluminum rather than steel as on the real thing, the bracket which holds the foregrip in place is susceptible to shearing under torque. Simoon did manufacture a steel gas block, but it is no longer available. It is possible to convert a real AUG gas block to work, and that is what I use on this rifle. I'll cover the needed modifications later. For the barrel itself, the stock one is aluminum, but Hephaestus makes steel replacements in 16-inch and 20-inch lengths. With a steel gas block and steel barrel, the rifle goes from somewhat rear-heavy, like most bullpups, to balanced over the pistol grip, just like the real thing. This makes the rifle feel significantly more comfortable to handle despite the marginally increased weight of steel. Note that the stock foregrip might wobble a bit. Well, so does the real one. It can be reduced with shims on the foregrip's axle pin, but be aware that getting the pin out can be difficult, so I advise messing with it as little as possible. The inner barrel length is 509mm for the 20-inch barrel, 400mm for the 16-inch barrel, and 350mm for the 14-inch barrel. Note that the stock barrels are AEG cut, not GBB cut, so you will need AEG buckings and barrels if you want to keep the stock hop unit. The stock hop unit is plastic with a fair amount of flex. While it's not bad, AEG buckings don't seem to seal as well as GBB buckings, and there are some very good aftermarket options available, mostly using BSR spec GBB buckings and barrels. So, depending on your budget, I recommend a few options. First, a PDI W-hold bucking will significantly improve accuracy with no other changes. Second, a TNT barrel, bucking, and hop unit combo is an easy way to improve performance with a minimum of work. It hops very well with a concave contact patch. Alternatively, the GBL hop unit is well made, but it did not have good results with the brass maple leaf barrel that came with it, so you will want to supply your own barrel. One last note on the barrel, there are two pins to be careful with. One secures the hop unit to the outer barrel, while the other secures a retaining post that keeps the barrel locked into the rifle. It is not a bad idea to keep these in place with a bit of superglue, otherwise they can easily fall out. That's it for the barrels, so on to the receiver. On this rifle, you may have noticed something strange about the lines of the scope mount. The GHK AUG's integral scope riser isn't quite as tall as the real thing, and this makes it hard for me to get low enough on the receiver to get a good sight picture. The easy fix here is a pair of washers on each screw to shim the sight a little higher, and now it feels more like the real thing, at the cost of a slight visual discrepancy. To adjust the sight, rotate the dial on the right side for windage and the bottom for elevation. There is a sight adjustment tool specifically for the GHK that will make this easier. One manufacturing issue of notice on this rifle is a little bit of rough machining on the guide rod rails, which can scratch up the guide rods over time and induce friction. I recommend checking these specific areas and polishing them with high grit sandpaper if there are any sharp edges. In the stock, I noticed the magazine well was very tight on the magazines out of the box, requiring significant force to seat or extract a magazine. This is easily fixed by sanding down the ribs on the inside of the magazine well until the magazines insert and come free with minimal resistance. The recoil rods are housed in the stock and shouldn't need replacement. However, they are aluminum and can potentially break, particularly if you put a lot of sustained full auto through the gun as I have. If this occurs, 4mm steel rod is a perfect fit for the slots, forming a very tight friction fit. Here I've built up some epoxy putty behind the rods to ensure they don't come out, and that's really all it takes. The bolt is very simple. To remove the nozzle, dump out the alignment block which just sits in the top of the bolt. Unscrew the hex screw on the back of the bolt, then pull the nozzle out the front. GHK offers 3 nozzles. The standard one does just under 1.5 joules, the low power one does about 1 joule, and the high power does about 2 joules. Out of the box, a nozzle may produce higher muzzle velocity than advertised and need time to break in. Now, if you find this process frustrating and would like direct control over your muzzle velocity, or if your gun shoots just a bit too hot after it's settled out, you can easily reduce the muzzle velocity with the grub screw mod. Drill a small hole in the side of the nozzle at a 45-degree angle forwards and insert a grub screw. The more of the nozzle the grub screw obstructs, the lower your muzzle velocity will be. Note that obstructing the nozzle will also slow down your rate of fire and reduce gas efficiency, so I would not recommend using it to make major adjustments. The nozzles are easy to swap out, so it's better to get one for each power level you expect to play at. The grub screw then allows you to fine-tune as needed. On the exterior of the bolt, the guide rods can come loose, which can induce cycling issues. These are actually threaded into the bolt, so a bit of thread locker will keep them in place. Lastly, I've added an O-ring to the collapsing section of the left guide rod. This extends the stroke of the bolt very slightly when manually cycling the gun, which helps the bolt to lock open on an empty magazine. Alright, let's go over the fire control group. The primary moving part is the main sear, which is pushed backwards by the trigger linkage. When the bolt goes all the way forward, it trips the auto sear. This unlocks the hammer, so now the gun can actually fire. When the trigger is pulled, the main sear moves backwards. This releases the hammer and fires the gun. The hammer is pushed back by the bolt, and is caught by the disconnector. When the trigger is released, the hammer drops off the disconnector and onto the main sear. After firing in semi-auto, if the trigger is pulled further, the disconnector is cammed forward so that it can no longer catch the hammer. At this point, the hammer drops whenever the bolt trips the auto sear, which produces full auto fire. Note that there is a separate spring that only engages when the sear travels past the semi-auto position. This provides additional resistance, helping to avoid unintentional full auto. Since the selector has a dedicated semi-auto position, which limits how far the trigger can be pulled, this spring isn't critical and can be removed if you want a lighter trigger pull. One common issue on these guns is that the bolt catch may fail to release when the user racks a charging handle. The reason is that the bolt catch is pulled down by a magnet, and it's not a very strong one. On mine, I removed the rubber buffer and added a 3mm by 2mm neodymium magnet instead. The extra magnet ensures that the bolt catch resets reliably without being too strong for the magazines to lock it open in the first place. As well, the housing for the fire control group can occasionally be too tight, causing the main sear to bind up and not travel freely. If it's mild, a bit of lubrication here will help. If that's not enough, it may be necessary to either carefully bend the walls of the trigger pack outwards or sand down the sides of the main sear to reduce its width slightly. Lastly, an insufficiently strong trigger spring may cause the sear to fail to return, which will manifest as a loose trigger that does not reset. The solution is to replace the mainspring. This more commonly affects older guns. Now for the mags. The rifle comes with a speed loader, but I highly recommend the loading adapters made by Comrade Quiche. These slot tightly over the top of the magazine and allow a normal AUG speed loader to fill the magazines. If a magazine is completely full, it may not seat on a closed bolt, as the top BB cannot compress downwards to make room. I make a habit of filling the mags and then removing one BB. To disassemble the magazine, first remove the base plate by sliding it forward, and dump out the follower spring and follower. Then, push the catch tab out to the side while pushing the magazine internals. When they come out, be wary of losing the bolt catch lever parts. To remove the feed lips or gas router, it is necessary to drive out a small securing pin. One popular modification for GHK magazines is the Devil Hunter mod. This is essentially converting a green gas magazine to use CO2, and it only works on GHK magazines because the green gas and CO2 mags use the same reservoirs, just with different fittings. Do not try this with any other brand of gas magazine. To perform the modification, simply unscrew the green gas output valve and insert a CO2 output valve. Then, fill the mag with CO2 through the fill valve. Using CO2 will give sharper blowback, many more shots per fill, and greater resistance to cold weather. However, it also increases wear and tear both on the magazine and on the gun. The gun has great gas efficiency to begin with, so personally I stick with green gas. I do not recommend the GHK magazines which use 12 gram CO2 capsules though, as they have a tendency to leak. Regardless of your power source, it is a good idea to get a valve tool for removing the main valves of the magazines. Periodic lubrication is all that is needed to keep them leak-free. I use silicone shock oil, which is thicker than spray oil and easier to control. If a mag starts leaking, it will usually be either from around the back of the output valve or from the front. In either case, the solution is to use a valve tool or pliers to extract the valve, clean and lubricate the O-rings, and reinstall. Inject gas and the leak should stop as the O-rings seal up. Another common issue is feed lip breakage, and one of the major contributing factors seems to be the tightness of the feed lips. On all my magazines, I've taken a steel file and lightly filed out the inside of the feed lips until I can push a BB through with the same amount of resistance as any of my other gas blowback magazines. Since doing this, I have not experienced any feed lip breakages, but it's not a bad idea to have a few spares on hand just in case. And lastly, this magazine has of course been painted. I used Rust-Oleum Satin Oregano for the body of the magazine, and then painted over with Viejo model color German Field Grey for the base plate. The actual greenish amber of the translucent AUG magazines is impossible to replicate on an opaque magazine, but this comes reasonably close to how a full mag looks in field conditions. Now for gun maintenance. Oiling the bolt carrier guide rods is a necessity. I use the same silicone shock oil that I used on the magazines for simplicity, but white lithium grease will also work. Minimal lubrication is needed in the fire control group and is mostly to reduce wear. I use a bit of oil on the contact points on the hammer and sears. The easiest way to check if the rifle is appropriately lubricated and free from friction is to pull back the bolt, ride it forward until it's just a few millimeters from being in battery, and then let go. It should be able to close fully without any momentum. There are a few accessories of note for the AUG. First, Steyr makes a sling specifically for the AUG of a simple 2-point design which loops through both sling swivels. Second, Simoon sells a sight adjustment tool which makes adjusting the scope much easier. The last area to cover is real steel compatibility. Unfortunately, there isn't much. The real stock is sufficiently different that fitting the GHK receiver is not possible, and likely could not be made to work either. The trigger groups are different sizes and will not interchange. 5.56 barrels cannot house Airsoft barrels, so that's out too. And the real receiver will not fit a GHK stock, so modifying that is out. However, a real gas block will work on the GHK with some modification. These are usually found with a stub of the barrel still encased within the block, which must be extracted. Unfortunately, they are interference fit, so a non-destructive solution is usually impossible. On mine, I used a Dremel cutting wheel to cut a channel along the gas block, then beat the barrel stub out with a mallet. The gas block was then epoxied onto a Hephaestus steel barrel, producing a full steel barrel setup. The only other piece of modification needed was to grind down the top of the gas block slightly and cut down the side a bit so as to fit in the GHK receiver. That's just a matter of guess and check until it fits. Note that the alignment is not perfect and the charging handle does not slot into the plate like it should, however this does not impact functionality. That wraps up this video. The GHK AUG is one of my favorite airsoft guns, combining good performance with realistic look and feel, and avoiding some of the pitfalls of other GHK replicas. It is not a cheap gun, but hopefully with this video you can get your money's worth from it. Thanks for watching.